Alright, so now we're going to put together what we learned about graphing demand and graphing supply. And as you can see here, we have both of those curves on the same graph. And so here is your demand curve. I've labeled that D1. And here's your supply curve that I've labeled S1. And right here in the middle, where they intersect, we are going to call that equilibrium. As you learned from your notes, this is the place where quantity supplied and quantity demand is equal. This is also, if you took it back out to the price curve, this would be the equilibrium price, the price at where producers are both willing to sell and consumers are willing to buy. This is the ideal place. This is where the market's always trying to get to. We say the market tends towards equilibrium. So we're going to look to equilibrium today to actually help us find out what would happen to price once we have shifted either the demand curve or the supply curve. And we'll be considering both the law of demand and the law of supply as we work these problems. Okay, so now I'm bringing up the instruction page for how to graph, and we're going to do the same two problems that we've been doing as we worked through graphing demand and graphing supply. But now that we have both of those curves on the same graph, we need to figure out which one we're shifting. In any given problem, you'll only shift one of the curves if there's a non-price determinant. If there's a price determinant, you will shift none of the curves. We'll simply, again, label what we know, but we need to know if we're dealing primarily with a change in quantity demand or a change in quantity supplied in those problems. So in order to understand that, we're going to add this third step, and this is where we simply ask a question. Who is affected first by the scenario in the word problem? If you answer the consumer, you're dealing with a change in either quantity demand or total demand, if it's a non-price reason. If you answer the producer, then it's a change in quantity supply or total supply, if it's a non-price reason. And you would choose from the supply list. So if you answer consumer, we're dealing with the category of demand, and you would either, again, have a price determinant and no shift, or you would have a non-price determinant. If we answer consumer, then we know that we're going to be looking at the demand list for non-price determinants, and we will be shifting the demand curve. If we answer producer, then we're looking at the list down here for non-price determinants for supply, and we would be shifting the supply curve. Okay. Now, on your problems, the way it's working is you will, when you get to that, you will read the word problem, you'll be asked the product, and then you'll be asked the variable, just like before. But we added a couple things. One, we're going to add in are we dealing with a change in overall demand where we shift for a non-price determinant? Are we dealing with a change in overall supply, S, which would be, again, a non-price determinant? Are we dealing with a change in QD, quantity demanded, or QS, quantity supplied? And once we know that, then we can go back to get the variable. We'll graph it, and then we'll look to equilibrium and find out what would price do following the changes that we just graphed. And we'll look to equilibrium to kind of give us a clue on that. So make sure that you're following the steps, and let's work a couple of the problems. I'm going to actually work the problems that are in your unit here. And so I'm going to read the first one. It says, in the automobile market, the local union negotiates a 20% pay raise for its workers. What happens in the automobile market? So we're going to again ask the same first question. What item are we supposed to graph? And in the problem it says what happens in the automobile market. So the product is going to be automobiles. We then ask the second question that we've been asking in our steps, which is, did the price of that item, automobiles, change? And in the problem, it said nothing about the price of automobiles. It did say that there's a 20% pay raise for the workers who make the automobiles. So we ask ourselves now the third question to figure out if we are dealing with an issue of supply or demand. And it says, who is affected first by the scenario in this word problem? And since we're dealing with the workers and the pay they receive, we're going to say that is a producer issue, okay? Because you have to pay the workers, so that they can make the product. And so we're dealing with a change in supply. And if you go back to the second question, did the price of the item we're graphing change? We answered no, because we said it wasn't a price change. We said it was a change in what we pay workers. So that's a non-price determinant. So you want to look at your non-price determinant list for supply. And if you go through those, you'll see that paying workers is the cost of labor, and that is an input. So we're going to put for our variable change in the cost of an input. And then in the following box, make sure that you acknowledge that it is a change in S. Now we're putting S capitalized instead of QS because we are shifting the entire supply curve as a result of this non-price reasoning. Okay, so next you're going to graph, and so for every graph you want to start off exactly with what you see here. You want to have your price on the y-axis like before. On the x-axis you want to have both QD and QS because it will depend on which one we're using. You want to have a supply curve and label it S1. You want to have a demand curve, we'll label it D1. And then you want to start off with equilibrium in the middle, and we're going to label that E1. Okay. Now, in this particular problem, since we know we're dealing with supply, we're only going to shift that curve. We're going to leave demand where it is. And it says in the automobile market, the local union negotiates a 20% pay raise for its workers. So we're going to say, okay, if we have to pay the workers 20% more and our costs have increased, will we supply more automobiles or less? And when you have a higher cost involved, you won't be able to supply as much of your product. So what we're going to have to do is decrease the supply at every price level, which means we will be shifting our curve to the left. So just like before, to the left-hand side, I know this line's not perfect. We're going to do a parallel line to the left of the original supply line. Now we're going to label this S2. And you can see that's moving to the left. Okay. Now, equilibrium, you'll notice there's a new intersect point. So this is where we're going to put equilibrium. And we're going to call that E2 because this is the new equilibrium. Okay. And so this would be your graph. Now the last box on your worksheet will ask, well, what happens to the change in price? Now the price of the good that you would find in the marketplace for the automobile is not listed on this graph. But what we can do by looking at equilibrium price from the original equilibrium, okay, it would strike the y-axis where price is here. So equilibrium price for the original curves is there. With the new equilibrium, okay, you notice that when we take equilibrium out, it's easier to see that the equilibrium price in the marketplace has now shifted upwards. Okay, so equilibrium price has gone up because it has to accommodate paying the workers more, and so now the businesses need more money to cover that cost. And so if equilibrium price goes up, we said earlier that the regular price would eventually follow. How long that takes and how quickly it increases, we don't know. But in your last column, then, you would want to acknowledge that price will increase. Okay, so that is a look at one of those problems that you're going to be working. Okay, and so let's work another one. I'm going to work one that in particular has price at the base of it. So you can kind of see what that looks like as well when you have both the supply and the demand curve on the graph. Okay. So let's look at that here for a minute. And so I'm going to go down to question number 5. Coca-Cola decides to drop the price of its cans from 50 cents to 30 cents. What happens in the market for Coca-Cola? So what we're going to do is we're going to again ask ourselves the questions that are on the instructions. First question we ask is, what item are we supposed to graph? Then we're going to ask ourselves the second question, did the price of that item, Coca-Cola, change? And we answer yes. And so again, on our instructions it says if the answer is yes, you're dealing with a change in either quantity demanded, QD, or quantity supplied, or QS. You'll just move along the current demand or supply curve and label the old price and the new price and the old quantity demand, quantity supplied, and the new quantity demand or quantity supplied on the graph or curve, but don't draw another curve. Just one of each curve, just like we see here, but we will label the curve that we are using. In other words, if we decide after step 3, are we dealing with a change in with consumers or producers, that'll tell us either supply or demand category. So we answered no, the price did not, or yes, the price did change, sorry. And so we are dealing with a change in price for our variable. And by going ahead and asking the third question, who is affected first, when prices change, prices, remember, are what consumers pay for a final product. Okay? And so when the prices change, the effect it has first is on the people who have to actually pay that price. So we're dealing with consumers. So as you can see up here in the third column, I've already answered, you'll have a change in quantity demanded. So now what we want to do is graph, and we want to go ahead and label what we know. We will not be shifting because it's a price change. And since we're dealing with change in quantity demand, what we're labeling is just going to be on the demand curve. Okay, so we do know the old price and the new price. So here's 0. The old price, it said, was 50 cents. Okay, so that's a little higher than what it's going to eventually be. So price 1 here is 50 cents. Okay, and so if I took my dotted line like we did before, and we ended up here on the demand curve, and then you go straight down. Okay, what we get down here, we don't know how many Coca-Colas were being demanded at that price, but we're going to go ahead and just put QD1, and that'll represent whatever amount that was. And now we know that the price has dropped, so somewhere below 50 cents, we'll put 30 cents and call that price 2. Okay. Now, when you do your dotted line here, because we have two graphs, you're going to notice that we're going to actually go over the supply curve. Okay, so you just want to ignore it because we are dealing with only a change in quantity demanded based on the third step of who is affected first. Okay, so we'll again go out to the demand curve. Call this QD because we don't know how many Coca-Colas were being demanded at the new price. And QD2. And again, we'll kind of test this with the law of demand since we're dealing with demand. When price decreases, quantity demanded will increase, move away from 0, getting higher in quantity. The last thing you of course have to fill out is what happens to price, and because equilibrium stays the same, the equilibrium price is the same, what happened was we had excess price here causing excess supply, and when you drop down to here, we're below equilibrium, which is going to cause excess demand or a shortage eventually. They'll eventually try to raise the price, but again, when it's a price change only, this line suffices, and we would just move, changing only the quantity that's being demanded. Okay, so what we would put in that last box then would be that price decreases because it did. It went from 50 cents to 30 cents. So equilibrium, as you can see, is pretty much the same as what we were doing before. We're just throwing in a third step so that we can determine are we dealing with a shift in supply, a shift in demand, a change in quantity demand, or a change in quantity supplied, just by asking who is affected first, and then moving or manipulating that particular curve, and if so, if there is a shift for a non-price determinant, adding in the new equilibrium like we did on the previous problem. And that's pretty much it. And so again, you'll always shift supply or the demand curve to the left. To the left for supply, of course, would be over here. For demand, it would be down here, and that's for a decrease in either at every price level. If there's an increase in either at every price level, it'd be to the right. So for supply, that's this way, and for demand, that's this way. Okay? That will always facilitate a change in equilibrium, which is what the real market price will eventually follow. And so we'll look to equilibrium to kind of determine what price will eventually do. If you have any questions, make sure that you contact me through Canvas. Thank you.